As the death toll rises, calls for his impeachment grow louder. Brazil's president has called the pandemic a media trick and threatened to screw anyone who opposes him. Can his popularity shield him from criticism, or could it ultimately be his downfall? I'm Imran Garta, and today's newsmaker is Jair Bolsonaro. On a day when almost 1,000 Brazilians died of COVID-19, their president was filmed on a late-night stroll enjoying a hot dog and a can of Coke. When asked about the skyrocketing number of cases, he responded with, "So what? What do you want me to do?" He describes the coronavirus as the little flu and has blamed everyone from his health minister to the media for the crisis. Nicknamed the Trump of the Tropics, Bolsonaro basks in comparisons to the US president, who sent Brazil 2 million vials of hydroxychloroquine, Trump's favorite self-prescribed medicine for treating the virus. Like the United States, demonstrations across Brazil are demanding an end to police brutality, and they're being met with brute force, while the president is accused of purposefully inflaming racial tensions. To his supporters, Bolsonaro is mito, a myth or legend, but is the myth placing his political survival above the welfare of his people? And just how unpopular does the right-wing leader need to become before he's no longer a populist? Haider Abbasi reports.
These are dark times for Brazil. Cases of coronavirus here are spreading rapidly. More than 500,000 people are infected. The Latin American country now has the second highest number of cases after the United States. And deaths too are rising. These people are releasing balloons to honor the more than 30,000 Brazilians who have died. Many people are blaming this man for the crisis.
In my case, given my athletic history, if I was to be infected, it would not necessarily concern me. I wouldn't feel anything other than, at most, a little cold or be under the weather.
Brazil's president has opposed most measures to try to contain the outbreak. He's encouraged people to socialize in public, has rejected the advice of health officials, and argued with governors for taking precautions. The result has been this: nightly protests by Brazilians, angry at the way their president has handled the crisis. Bolsonaro has also attacked the media, saying journalists have deceived the public in their reporting of the novel coronavirus. Last month, Brazil's health minister resigned just 2 weeks into the job. Nelson Teich didn't say why he was quitting, but he was pressured by Bolsonaro to endorse an unproven anti-malarial drug to fight COVID-19. Brazil has now lost 2 health ministers. Teich's predecessor was fired in April for resisting pressure to reopen the economy. Although Bolsonaro's support is dwindling, around a third of Brazilians continue to back him. Criticism of the president is growing among the opposition, who are demanding he be impeached. Will Bolsonaro's response to the pandemic force him to step down, or does he still have time to be redeemed? Haider Abbasi, The Newsmakers.
Well, to see if redemption is in Bolsonaro's future, let's bring in our guests. Joining us from Bethesda, Maryland, is economist Otaviano Canuto. He was Brazil's former deputy finance minister and was the vice president of the World Bank. Chayenne Polimedio joins us from Charlestown, Rhode Island. She is a fellow with the Political Reform Program at New America, a think tank based in Washington, D.C. And in Burlington, Massachusetts, is Julio Morais, the executive director for Public Administration Institution, a consulting firm for governments and entrepreneurs. Good to have you all on the program. Otaviano Canuto, more than 30,000 Brazilians are dead. Everyone has been affected by this pandemic around the world. But has Bolsonaro been particularly reckless with his people's lives?
Yes. A poll taken last week among the Brazilian population revealed that those who think Bolsonaro's government is a good one have declared themselves, 75% declared ready to go to the streets, ready to leave home, and so on, as compared to 35% of those who don't think the Bolsonaro's government is a good one. So in this regard, Bolsonaro's, for those for whom he's a leader, are more, let's say, apt to go out to disrespect the directives of confinement and so on. And not by chance, Brazil's rates of social distancing, as measured by mobility, are below the average.
Right.
And it's been proved that social distancing has matters a lot with respect to the rate of infection. So yes, his leadership has, let's say, led many Brazilians to not respect social distancing directives.
Right. Julio Morais, disrespecting the directives. That's what Otaviano says. And that seems to be at the heart of it. Why has he given this kind of macho response to the experts? Why has he almost given this deliberately unlettered persona when it comes to a virus? Why don't you listen to the doctors and say, okay, maybe we need to humble ourselves and let the experts take control?
Well, Brazilian faced with two situations. Either they're gonna die with COVID-19 or they're gonna die with starvation. What Bolsonaro is trying to do is save the Brazilian economy that he earned from the previous administration. Right now, the people who protest him, who support him, are the middle class. Those are the business owners. Those are local business owners who support the local community and employ local residents. Those are the ones that take the family and go out to protest in favor of Bolsonaro right now. So the situation the Brazilians facing right now, either they're gonna end up in starvation without employment and money, or they're gonna work and take the risk to get COVID-19. But
So,
let's say
but Julio,
something.
Julio, just to that point, do you then believe that it was necessary for him to deliberately underplay the virus? To say, oh, it's not a big deal, because he needs to tell his people this so that they can go out and work?
Let's compare the virus with other viruses, for example. Like Brazil right now is what? 200 people get affected, something like that, for a population of 2 million. So if we get a percent, I think it's, if I'm not mistaken, it's 0.4% of the population infected. So it's a
30,000 people are
minority.
dead. But, I mean, again, compared to the rest of the world, Brazil is second. Brazil has a far smaller population than India, than China. It's far ahead of them. So with that in mind, Brazil's doing far worse. It could have been better. Yes?
Yes, that's correct. But what about the fake news?
What
A
fake
couple
news?
days, a couple weeks ago. Well, a couple weeks ago, we have the federal police knock at the Rio governor's door, and after that, I believe like 1,100 death was report.
Okay, I don't know
So
what you're
right
talking about.
now,
I have no idea what you're talking about when it comes to that, right? So we can come back to it later on if you want, but I want to bring Cheyenne into this now, and we're going to broaden this out into calls for impeachment, the corruption allegations, and so on. But to the point of COVID-19, Cheyenne, Julio makes the point that Brazilians have been faced with a choice. You either starve to death or you die from COVID-19. That's, Julio, who's a fan of Bolsonaro, a supporter of Bolsonaro. Do you see it that way, Cheyenne?
I don't necessarily see it that way, but I think that, you're talking about a country that doesn't have either of the two important things that we need to have during a time of crisis. So we don't have a strong public health system. So we don't have a system that can handle, the high level of cases. But we also don't have a welfare system that can keep people at home and give them the financial assistance that they need to stay home. So in a sense, yes, there is this kind of dilemma that a lot of Brazilians face because there's this fear of catching the virus and this fear of, yes, if I get it, I might not be able to get to a hospital and I will die. But there's also this very urgent concern that, yes, if I stay home for much longer, how am I going to be able to afford rent? How am I going to be able to pay the bills? So I don't think it's not a right and wrong, but there is definitely a real dilemma for a lot of
Okay,
Brazilians in
but
trying to think how to
Cheyenne,
go about this.
the dilemma is not being offered to the Brazilians in a sense that it's accepting the consensus science about COVID-19 and saying, but there is
Oh
a dilemma, right?
no.
So it's being offered as this is fake, so go out and work, right? So I mean, for example, full disclosure, I'm a South
Right.
African. There's many similarities between South Africa's economy, South Africa's culture, and so on, and Brazil, and where it is as a nation, right? Sort of middle income
Yeah.
and so on. And the South African president would put out the argument that this is a dangerous thing, and yes, we might need to impoverish ourselves to a certain extent in order to get through this. It's dangerous, we need to stay home, but we also need to open up the economy. Is that same conversation being had, Cheyenne, in Brazil?
Well, it's being had by some people. The health ministers who have resigned have had that kind of narrative, but not Bolsonaro, and that's not surprising. You have this president using, strongman tactics and this sort of, nothing can reach me, and everything that's coming my way that is in the form of criticism is only, the left's ploy to undermine my presidency and undermine all the great work that I've done. So anything that comes in as a criticism, he's immediately going to, fight back and call it, fake news, or say that that's not true, it's not as bad, it's not as serious, because any type of criticism could really undermine a presidency that's already, leaning towards a demise.
Okay. Otaviano, do you agree that this is a presidency leaning towards a demise?
Yes. One important point, we need to have the figures on the right note. Brazil has currently the 6th highest number of deaths per million inhabitants. So it is not true that Brazil is not, let's say, a case of bad performance when it comes to containment. And worse, the curve is still rising, is not flat. So this may get worse. Second, it's a myth, this idea that there is a trade-off between doing social distancing and economics. Look at what Sweden has been saying the last few days. The chief epidemiologist is regretting the fact that they underplayed the relevance of social distancing policies. And the Swedish economy is not performing much better. So before we have the flattening of the curve in Brazil, we will keep having demand shocks and the necessity of further policies ahead that will make the Brazilian economic performance be worse than it has been. Brazil will pay a price for the neglect by the president with respect to the disease. That's the fact, not ideology. There's no such a thing as a trade-off.
Having said that, Otaviano, there's still a lot of people who are deeply loyal to this president. Are they going to listen to you?
Well, little by little. The question is, it's true that there is a hardcore of loyalists to Bolsonaro, let's say, which is enough to give him, let's say, a resilience base, not necessarily enough to allow him to be reelected, but it's one that, let's say, takes off the steam, the will to go ahead with impeachment processes, for instance.
So let me ask you, Julio. Julio, would you consider yourself a hardcore Bolsonaro loyalist?
Yes, I am, especially for the fact that he looked for middle class, like people like myself, that has business and trying to avoid the lockdown.
Right, and this is fully respected. I wonder at this particular time, so if we look at the coronavirus crisis and Brazil's numbers, that in context, relative to other nations, those numbers are quite bad. We've seen protests in multiple cities regarding police brutality, right? More than 600 Brazilians killed by police just this year alone, 5 months into this year. A lot of those protesters also finding common ground with Black Lives Matter and the other protests that are happening in the United States and elsewhere. Calls for impeachment. We've got investigations by the Supreme Court, by the Electoral Commission, by Congress, multiple investigations, more than 20. With all of this in mind, as a hardcore Bolsonaro loyalist, are you a little worried? Are you feeling under pressure that maybe time's up?
I am. Honestly, I am. But the fact is, Bolsonaro trying to run a country, and we have the Supreme Court, we have the Congress, we have the state governors going against him. It's tough for him to propose any law or propose any improvement in Brazilian government if we have all the other parts of government against him.
But I've had Lula's lawyer on this show, and she was saying that the Supreme Court and Congress and all of them were against the left wing, right? And so that's why the left was all embroiled in this corruption scandal. So that's exactly the same argument. You understand, from my perspective, Julio, I've seen this movie before.
Yes, but let's put it this way. All the majority of the Supreme Court are appointed by Lula and Dilma, and they went against them. For the left wing, everyone that turns against them, it's an anti-democracy. It's not a pro-democracy. So everyone, they always victimize themselves for whatever they have done. I think the consequence that we deal right now with the health, public health, and all the situation is from the previous administration. Bolsonaro is getting the blame for everything, but let's take a look for the corruption probe and everything that Dilma and Lula did. And right now, that's the
but the whole point, Julio, wasn't it that all of that was getting cleaned up by getting rid of Lula, by getting rid of Dilma, and so on? And now this was a new administration that promised it was going to be clean, yet we're hearing about money laundering again.
Not with the administration. I mean, we have Flávio Bolsonaro, the son, who's being investigated, and I think he should be investigated as well, but not the president. Compared to Lula and Dilma in the previous administration, the entire administration was locked down. There was sentence. Lula got sentenced to jail because of corruption. Dilma was impeached because of bad administration. And the whole situation right now, which Bolsonaro is trying to fix it, the Brazilian people are suffering right now with no infrastructure, a weak economy, and no public health to deal with the situation.
Okay, so Chayenne, is this a guy who's trying to clean up the mess and he's facing resistance from a corrupt establishment, as has been portrayed by Julio?
No. Unfortunately, what we're seeing here is just the epitome of hyperpolarization and hyperpartisanship that Brazilian politics has been going through, and it's only getting worse over the last few months. So you see both sides, the left and the right, not thinking that the rule of law and the institutions in place are working on their behalf, right? And that's very, very dangerous. We see a lot of attempts and resistance from, the Supreme Court and the electoral courts in trying to retain neutrality and trying to uphold the rule of law precepts. But we see a lot of pushback. We see a lot of, diminishing of its role from the Bolsonaro administration and his allies. And again, going back to this, populist strongman, us versus them versus us narrative, where anything that goes against what Bolsonaro is trying to do and his hold on to power is seen as interference, is seen as bias from the left or from those that are trying to undermine his administration.
Otaviano Canuto, this hyperpolarization, how dangerous is it?
Well, it is always dangerous, as in any highly polarized situation. Let's keep in mind something quite straight. Bolsonaro fired his Minister of Justice, the main leader of the investigation processes against the PT. And the reason was a clash about Bolsonaro's will to interfere with the federal police investigations with respect to his sons. So let's keep this straight. This polarization between Bolsonaro and PT with respect to due behavior regarding corruption and so on cannot claim to be true because they're sounding like the same. And so I would say that that's one of the main reasons why Bolsonaro has lost a cohort of his electorate, corresponding to those who voted on him not because of himself, but because of the Workers' Party. And he's losing that credibility. He's staying only with the core, the hardcore of his loyalists. Right. One important thing, Imran, that I'd like to state, not to miss it, the averages in Brazil with respect to coronavirus are bad, but Brazil is a heterogeneous country. There is a state, for instance, in southern Brazil, Rio Grande do Sul, that has done the right things, has adopted the policies at the right time, right, and has succeeded to keep the rates of mortality very much lower than everywhere else. So in order to be fair, yeah, the average is not good, but there is some good performance in Brazil.
Yeah, it's a massive country, and it's a good point that you make. Otaviano, I want to ask you, just to, putting on your World Bank or former World Bank hat and not your former Brazilian politician hat, what would they be thinking in these institutions such as the World Bank when they look at Brazil under Bolsonaro right now? Would they consider it to be sliding in the wrong direction?
With respect to the coronavirus, yes. You may note how the World Bank and IMF have released recent reports, this week in fact, showing clearly the relevance of containment policies, of lockdown policies, soft or hard lockdown policies, as a way to impede the diffusion of the coronavirus. And they also have highlighted the economic negative impact of contamination and so on. So technically speaking, these institutions consider the Bolsonaro's approach, the overall approach, as a lousy one with economic consequence. Where there is some sympathy in these institutions with respect to the Bolsonaro government is with the economic reform agenda that was set out, let's say, in the beginning of Bolsonaro's government, which should be, in fact, his priority. His government should be pushing ahead with the structural reform agenda that would allow the Brazilian economy to grow more in the future, instead of focusing on noise and focusing on defending his family.
Right. I've got 2.5 minutes left on the program. So briefly, Chayenne, Lula's been calling for his impeachment. A lot of people would look at it and say, well, of course you would say that, Lula. You've just freshly been released. You served your own time. Will he be impeached? Do you think he will be, Chayenne?
It's possible, yes. The numbers are not there yet, but if there is enough public support, and right now I was looking at some numbers last night, and we're looking at 50-50 on impeachment hearings. We're looking at 50-50 on Bolsonaro stepping down and 50-50 on his ability to lead the country. So we are seeing a trend. We're just waiting to see if there's enough support in Congress. There is a lot of other things going on. There is a left and right coalition, this manifest for democracy that's been signed, and it's going around as this sort of revival of a pro-democratic movement, very much like the one that Brazil had at the end of the dictatorship years.
Right.
So there is a civil society plus government movement that seems to indicate that impeachment is not completely out of the question.
Julio, if he is impeached, would that be unjust?
I think so, but I think it would be worse for the Brazilian economy right now if that happens.
Chayenne was saying, Julio, that there's a possibility that he might step down given all the pressure from multiple directions. That would seem out of character given the strongman persona, right, Julio? What's your sense on this? Do you think it's possible that he could even go, okay, it's too much, I might throw in the towel here?
No, I don't think so. He likes to be tough. He's a strong guy. As far as I know him and the entire family, he'll have the support of his family, his supporter like myself. I don't think that's gonna happen.
Okay, it's been a really good conversation. I appreciate you all taking the time to talk to us here on the Newsmakers. Chayenne Polimedio, Julio Morais, and Otaviano Canuto. I wish you all well. Thank you very much for joining us on the show.
Thank you.
And thank you for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.